Okay, chapter 3 looks at the cellular form and function. So we're going to be talking about that for the next several videos. Alright, so when we talk about the cell, if we go back to looking at the organization of living things, we're looking at this level here. We've already talked about the atomic level, molecular, macromolecular in chapter 2. We're actually going to be talking about the organelle level in chapter 3 as well. But I'm going to talk about the cell first before we get into the organelles. Alright, so if we want to talk about how we can describe the cell, this concept map kind of describes how we can do that. We can really break it down into two parts. We have the plasma membrane, which is essentially the barrier or the boundary that defines the cell, and then we have the stuff that's contained within that barrier, within that boundary, and that's the cytoplasm. And when we talk about cytoplasm, it's really just a general description that talks about the organelles, which are the structures that allow the cell to function in its specific way. Inclusions would be any molecules or chemicals or substances produced by the cell or stored in that cell. And the cytosol is, for the most part, the water that all these things are kind of floating in or suspended in, if you will. We jump back to the plasma membrane real quick here. And we will go into some detail about this in subsequent videos, but it's a very specialized structure, and it has many of the three of those four major organic molecules we talked about: proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids, and we'll address all that. And it's important to know, and we'll talk about this too, that the plasma membrane is involved in various transport processes, some of which require ATP, others of which do not require ATP. And so we'll get into all those in subsequent videos. Okay, so let's just talk about cells in general right now. There are over 200 different types of cells in the body with various shapes, sizes, various forms, and various functions. And again, when we talk about this idea of form and function, it applies to these cells as well. We have cells that are elongated, we have cells that are spherical, we have cells that are flat, that are cubed, that are column-shaped, we have cells that are in different layers, we have cells that are disc-shaped, we have cells that are flattened with multiple projections coming off of them. And we'll address those different types of cells when we get into the different chapters, but just please understand that there's many different cell types that have a variety of shapes and structures, and because of that shape and structure, that will define what their function is. Let's talk about what we call the composite cell. Because we have so many different types of cells with so many different functions, not all of the structures found inside of a cell are going to be found in every single cell in the body. And based on the function of those cells is going to determine what we're going to find in those cells. So what we want to talk about briefly is what we call the composite cell. So if we were to just take a cell and assume that this cell had every single organelle in it, this is what it would look like. Okay? And so what we're going to find inside that cell, as I mentioned earlier, is the organelles. And these are the miniature organs that essentially are defining what that cell does. And there's a lot of different organelles with a lot of different functions, and I'm not going to list them all here. That will be a subsequent assignment for you, but please understand that not all cells have all of these structures. Let me just highlight a couple of these things for you. We have the nucleus of the cell, which essentially is the control center. It contains the genetic material, which really are the instructions about how that cell is supposed to function. We have various inclusions, which would include lipid droplets, other vesicles that are storing hormones or other chemicals that are produced by that particular cell. We have what we call a cytoskeleton, which really keeps that cell's shape. Okay, and those include microtubules and microfilaments, which I'm not sure are on here. And then we have various organelles which may be membrane bound or not. So things like the Golgi complex is actually a series of membranes. The endoplasmic reticulum, both the rough and the smooth, are membrane bound. The mitochondria are membrane bound. Lysosome are membrane bound. And then we have things that are not membrane bound, that are essentially just macromolecules found within the cytosol. Those that include these ribosomes here, these little dots. Also include the microtubules, even though they're part of the skeleton. And there's a few others I don't necessarily call centrosomes, and the centrioles would also be non-membrane bound organelles. So if we were to list the basic components of a cell, this is what we would find. We'd have the plasma membrane, or cell membrane. We would have what we call the intracellular fluid, which is the cytosol. We would have the cytoskeleton, and this is a series of proteins that is very important to the structure and shape of the cell. It also helps the cell to actually change its shape when it needs to during various transport processes. We would find the organelles, which I kind of listed some. And then we also associate with every cell, we have the extracellular fluid, which is the fluid that surrounds the cell, whether it's outside over here, or maybe in between, or down here. There is always a fluid associated with the outside of a cell called the extracellular fluid. So keep these in mind as we talk about cells, and as we get into the different chapters and talk about the different cells in the different chapters. Different cells are going to have different organelles based on their functions, and I'll try to make sure that those get pointed out, and if I don't, please make a notation and let me know so that I can address those in classes.